Redditors who knew men caught on to catch a predator before the show. What were they like? Oh, I can actually answer this one. He legit was always trying to sleep with men that were way too young for him, albeit just barely legal, and we made jokes all the time to him about how he was going to wind up on that show. We literally called him Herbert. It was the opposite of a he was the last person I would suspect situation. Did he end up getting convicted? I read somewhere that only like 1/4 or 1/3 of the people that get caught on that show actually end up with a conviction. I'm not totally sure how things wound up for him, as this revelation seemed like the opportunity I'd been looking for to distance myself from him. He definitely got arrested. He's definitely a registered sex offender now, but I don't think he went to prison, or if he did it couldn't have been for very long. I didn't know the person directly, but I worked at a company that had an employee caught on the show. This was particularly problematic, as the company was Nickelodeon Animation. Everyone who knew the guy was actually pretty shocked. It was particularly rough for his girlfriend at the time, as she also worked at the studio, so there was no hiding from it. For their part, Nickelodeon instituted rigorous background checks for every new employee after the incident, with zero tolerance for any misdeeds involving children. Those background checks are what keeps this lore alive though, as the process is much more intensive than any other studio. Yes, Matty Natch, he was creepy and kept trying to get me to go to Burning Man. When I told him I didn't think that was a good idea because I had a 10-year-old kid at the time, he said I should bring my kid. Now I don't think he was interested in my kid at all, but I did tell him I thought that would be super creepy to bring a kid to Burning Man with a bunch of people on E. This was in 2001. He came over to my house under the guise of talking business and then put the moves on me. I turned him down and sent him home to his wife. So in high school we had a shop teacher, Ike. Stand-up guy, super nice to everyone. I always got a weird vibe with how people talked about him, but the story was that he had an extra room in his house. For years, over a decade, he would take the kids that were in trouble, down and out fighting with the law or fighting with their parents, and give them a place to stay and get back on their feet. This had been going on well before I started going there, so as you can imagine there had been a couple accusations against him. Kids he targeted were always already in trouble to begin with, so nothing held up. Fast forward to 2001, grade 9 English class. One day, class starts and apparently he had been arrested on accusations on the weekend. Our English teacher comes in to start class completely broken down in tears. Goes on a giant tirade about how disgusting it is that false accusations can ruin a good man's career and that we will have a substitute because her and an army of other teachers admin staff are going down to City Hall to protest and stand up for him. This went on for a few days. Eventually the charges were dropped and dismissed. There was even a front page news article that more or less discredited the kid and implied he was being falsely accused. He got off and kept his job. Fast forward a few years later after I graduate, and sure enough he gets caught completely red-handed. Turns out for over 10+ years he was getting away with this while the school defended him at every turn. When he finally got arrested, caught and convicted, the news article was literally half a paragraph printed in the backside of the paper in the courts section. Not even a photo. I would not be at all shocked if more admin staff were involved than just him. I feel so bad for all those kids who were brave enough to come forward over the years just to have an entire school administration and justice system turn against them. Ah, stunning. Remember the fine young lad who got caught not once, but twice? Went to my high school. Had a class or two with him. I was one dude's RA in university. He was a seriously weird dude, but was relatively friendly. Came out to all of the campus events, and was not suspected of being a predator at all by any of us in the dorms back in those days. He was busted on TCAP about 2-3 years after I graduated, so probably sometime 2003 to 2005. How was he weird? Probably something to do with effing children, but I'm not sure. I fortunately don't know any predators, but I did work with a young woman who had worked on the show. She did the post-production voiceovers for the catfishing texts between the detectives and the predators. She was the voice of the non-existent teen girl, like the "oh I don't know much about sex, I'm only 13 lol" stuff. Apparently she was a production assistant or intern at the production office, and one of the producers was like, "We need somebody with a young sounding voice, you say something," and she did, and he was like, "Perfect, come with me," and she recorded all the dialogue. right after she told a bunch of us at work. This was a couple years later at a different job. I went home that night and watched an episode and could tell it absolutely was her voice. Hilarious. Weren't on to catch a predator, but my ex-stepdad was a pedophile. Before he went to jail for his third time, my mom didn't know when she married him. We would see his family a lot. His brother was always very nice and liked having us over. They would sometimes get weird with each other and his brother would make comments about my body every now and then. After my ex-stepdad went to jail, his brother was caught on an online chat sting. He somehow got my contact info when I was an adult and thought it was appropriate to tell me he was attracted to me when I was 12. Weirdly, they both didn't like each other being alone with young girls and at least once referred to the other one as a pedophile. I was too young to really understand it back then. Alright, I actually knew a guy who ended up getting caught on TCAP. We were not super close or anything, but we took a few classes together and had labs together. To give you some time context, I would have met him originally in like 2001 or 2002. It was my senior year in high school, but I was taking a community college physics class. He was 1 year older than me, having just graduated the year early. He was born in '83, I was born in '84. I didn't really get to know him very much in that course, but I did in a later that I was taking in like late 2002 or early 2003. I knew him from physics classes, nothing else. I remember we were in the same lab group, so we were spending 3-4 hours at a time working on some lab project. He was an immigrant from India and a rather small man, very thin and fairly short. He was a Sikh and kept his hair covered. His English was pretty good though, you can just sort of tell. This guy was the type of guy who had no luck with girls, like zero. Which is really common for a lot of dudes at this age though, but this was like worst case scenario for a guy. He had no attention of any kind from women. And we are in a physics class. Awkward with girls probably explains the majority of young guys in that class at that time in our lives. One time he wanted to teach me a lesson about never meeting girls online. He told me a story about how his friend, figure similar situation, was trying to meet girls online and then he met this one. She looked a little chubby in her face in her picture, but then he went to go meet her at the amusement park, and to his horror, it was a very obese woman. His friend had no idea on how to bail, so he just sort of went along with it. They went and did some rides. Then they got on the roller coaster, where when the ride ended she got stuck, and the ride operator was unable to help her. So they had to shut it down, call in a technician who had to disassemble the ride to get her out. As he was telling me this story, he was laughing harder and harder. He then proceeded to point to an obese woman in the class and he whispers to me, "And let me tell you, my friend, it was her right over there," and he then erupted into laughter. And that, my friend, is why you do not want to meet women online, because you never know what you could get yourself into. I remember the class he told me this joke in. And I remember taking it in spring of 2003, so I would have been like 18 or had just turned 19. That was the last class I took with him, but I do recall seeing him in the summer of 2004, at a different school, when I was waiting for a ride home, in a parking lot for about a minute or two. Basically just said hello, asked what we are doing at the place, then sort of just left. We were never online buddies. My space friends ordered anything in any social context outside of a classroom or lab. No lunch, no party, nothing. He ended up getting busted on TCAP in Jan of 2006. I don't recall seeing the episode until 2007 or so. I remember the story he told me about meeting women online. I honestly have the hunch that the Sting was the first person that was ever talking to him sexually. Like, if he said he has never done such a thing, I believe it. The guy was an absolute max level incel long before the incel movement. I did read the chat log he had with a decoy and it was pretty sick though. The dude was definitely effed up. If you watch the show, he was the guy who claimed to be into academics and know about the law when trying to talk to Chris Hansen. That was definitely the vibe I remember from in class. Another not on the show but close encounter story. My dad pulled my brother and I from a fancy expensive elementary school and put us in public school despite him really wanting us in a private school. He said after meeting the principal a couple of times, he had a weird feeling, strong enough to override my mom not having felt the same way. We were starting 1st and 3rd grade and then switched to a new school. 6 years later the guy was busted for molesting a couple of his young students, girls and boys. My dad told me this story years later, right after another strange incident, when he and I were on a train, and when we got off he had us duck around a lot of people and pillars. I didn't get why. The dude across from us had been absolutely hardcore eyeing me, a 15-year-old dressed for opera girl, but I figured that was, regrettably, normal. But dad said when he's eyeing me too, it's a problem. I trusted my dad about people ever since. Not on the show because we're not American, but there was a group that was looking for people accessing certain sites, and my cousin's ex was one of them. She actually found out by checking his computer, but it was horrifying to her. I was a kid around this time, so what I remember from him is that for the most part he was quiet. One thing is, in our culture we kiss each other's cheeks as a greeting, but when I did it I think I missed or something. Don't remember exact details, and the whole family laughed lightheartedly. I looked back at him, but there was this weird look in his eyes I couldn't exactly understand as a kid, which freaked me out immensely. I remember kind of running away in a weird embarrassment afterwards, but it's a memory that stuck to me for my whole life. A few years ago my cousin confessed about why they really broke up all of those years ago, and I just remember that specific moment and felt so scared like I did as a kid. It's a face I don't think I'll forget. He was never on the show, but I know a guy who got busted for molesting at least one little boy at the daycare he worked at. Didn't know him particularly well, just saw him from time to time at UGR regionals, and he was good friends with this creepy gigolo guy, and both thought they were hot and constantly talking down on people. I never particularly liked either, but the eventual molester was mostly under my radar. Just some jackass I occasionally saw. I hadn't thought of him for years when one day my friend messaged me the news story of his arrest. Apparently the gigolo was defending him until the very end, despite having kids of his own by then. I was roommates with a person on the show for a bit. His name was Dave, and he was one of the few people they let go when they started having the sheriff stepped waiting outside. Felt bad for the guy. Completely gullible and too nice of a dude. It was the Riverside CA episode where two really young guys show up at the house. Basically my buddy was out in Cali visiting a friend that told him that he needed to detour to drop in on this girl he's been chatting with. No age was mentioned, and it's not like he could say no, as the only car they had was his friend's in California's car. So he's like, sure, I'm down to tag along. Immediately regretting the decision when Chris Hansen pops out. They only interviewed his friend and he just had to stand there nervously guzzling a Rockstar waiting for it to be over. Funnily, when Chris told them they could go, they thought they were in the clear and were giggling on the way out until a bunch of cops in tactical gear jumped them in the driveway. Lol. Like I said, they let him go with no issues as he never had contact with the girl and had only been in state for less than 24 hours. Really suck though, cause when the episodes were still available online that whole episode had his face as the thumbnail. My mom used to know one of the guys, said he was always a nice guy and quick with a joke. She said she was not really surprised to see him where he was when the show was on television. Yep, she had a lot of good things to say about Chris Hansen. Okay, so he wasn't on that show, but a Facebook group of hunters outed him. This lad was in my rugby team. He was weird, just straight up weird, but in a way that made you feel sorry for him, being a progressive group of lads and inclusive to everybody. We welcomed him into the team, made him feel part of the group. He was always scruffy. He looked like a worm. He was the type of kid that at school bullies would have wet dreams about. But like I say, our team prides itself on having a place for everybody, just not him anymore. Then this video circulates on Facebook where he's been outed and admitting to messaging what he thought was a 13-year-old girl for sex. Nobody was surprised, but everybody was sickened. Well, he, 40s at the time, wasn't on the show, but he was busted in a police sting. Thought he was meeting a 14-year-old girl at a park and he had a bag of lingerie for her. He had been chatting online with an officer posing as the 14-year-old. Creepy stuff. Anyway, he was part of my friend group at the time. I wasn't super close with him, but I had spent some time around him in pretty normal group activities. He was a bit weird, but most of our group was, so he didn't really stand out. He would make some pretty odd comments about women, and especially younger women, at times, and usually get mocked for it, but I don't think any of us thought he'd do anything like he did. He was married, happily to the best of my knowledge, and had a really good government job. When news reached our friend group, it was a pretty big shock to all of us, but it definitely brought to mind some of the weird she used to say. Pretty sure everyone pretty much immediately blocked him on social media. I don't know how much time he spent in jail, if any. I know he lost his wife and his job. Last I heard, he had moved across the country. He doesn't come up in conversation much anymore, but anytime he does, we refer to him as Pedophile Bob. Actually, a friend of mine's roommate ended up being one. He was super normal and kind of good looking. He had a girlfriend as well. The only odd thing about him was that he had inherited a bunch of money from his family, all in cash. Aside from that, he was in his 20s and you'd never think it at all. He was one of the ones that thought he was meeting a 16-year-old girl or something like that. He also wasn't very bright. Guy I knew wasn't on the show but was caught in a huge operation with undercover agents. He was very arrogant and covertly racist. I was really good friends with his brother, but I hated him. I should not have, but I was pretty cruel to him over the years. I just felt like he needed humbling and I would take every chance to do it. He finally admitted he hated me for it. Anyway, he tricked some poor girl into marrying him by acting like a good Christian guy. They started having problems early on. I thought she'd leave him, but she stayed. Years later, he's caught trying to meet a 13-year-old for sex. Had tons of CP on his phone and computer. Currently rotting in jail. I didn't know him personally, but he went to the same church as me when my parents forced me to be religious, and I never knew he existed. He tried to lure an 11-year-old girl from the internet to the local park, pretending to be her age, but that 11-year-old girl was actually a 19-year-old dude, I think that was his age, who had known about him being a creep and wanted to turn him into police for it. I didn't know anyone from that show, but I did know a guy who got caught for the same thing. It was the early 2000s. He was my friend's husband. He met a 13-14-year-old girl in a D&D chat room when he was in his mid-20s, groomed her, traveled to another state to see her, then took her to New Orleans. He got caught, a lot of years in jail. My friend divorced him. He was extremely egotistical, and I always hated him. To the right people, he came across as charming. He used everyone and everything he could. Named himself after a popular vampire, but spelled it wrong. I remember throwing his stupid red lens glasses into the street. He was the type to buy booze for teenagers. Used to work retail with a guy in Scotland who got caught in a sting by an independent group here. Was doing my thing stacking shelves when I overheard two customers marching down the aisle sounding oddly suspicious. Initially I thought they were plotting to steal, before it turned out the dude had out-of-date Facebook info about which store he worked at and they came looking for him. He was originally hired as a good friend of my old boss and had been invited along personally to several nights out with a few of us. Within a few hours of the group visiting the store, there was a Facebook Live video of him being confronted at his house. From what I was told, my buddy who was a manager was advised by our old boss not to mention anything about it on FB, as some high up people within the company were all too aware of the fact he'd been hired specifically as a close personal friend of a store owner and were extremely worried about it getting out and causing them bad PR. None on the show, but a lot of pedophile teachers when Kay was growing up. When my parents first moved us out of a really bad neighborhood, we thought things would be better. Nope. Not only did my 5th grade teacher hate male students, he constantly touched the female students. He would run their shoulders and just get lower and lower down the front. He would have them rub his shoulders and feet too. Fine creep. He was arrested a couple years later. My health teacher in high school was busted with CP on his work computer. Later his friend, who was the pay teacher, was caught with pictures of naked gym students on his computer too. This next one was in a gray area. The student was held back a year in like elementary or something like that, so by the time she was a senior, she was 18. And this was the teacher's first year working at the district, so there's no way they knew each other when she was a minor. He was young too, like mid-24 or something. After she graduated they started dating. The district didn't like the idea of a high school teacher dating an ex-student of his, so they fired him. That was 10 years ago and they married with 2 kids.